A new, sophisticated breed of anarchists is taking over America by becoming political leaders who refuse to lead or solve any of the nation's problems, and instead promote destructive partisanship, irresolvable division, and ruinous gridlock. With anarchists leading the government, there is no longer a functioning government in place. In effect, they eliminate the government by becoming its deliberately ineffectual leaders. In this way, they destroy society and the social order and bring down the government, which is the anarchists' goal. In the name of law and order, they promote civil war, separatism, and secession. The anarchists have become politicians who seek office, then refuse to lead or intentionally mislead the government in order to send the nation into chaos, which drives us to ruin. Their actions tell the story their words are meant to conceal. As president, Donald Trump refused to deport the tens of millions of illegal aliens he knew were residing in America, and he allowed violent mobs to run free in the streets in 2020. Trump failed to provide the needed leadership and instead sponsored the enemies of America against us. Joe Biden has opened the borders and allowed cities to collapse and deadly drugs to spread among us as American infrastructure crumbles and American prestige dies around the world. Both Republicans and Democrats refuse to lead and instead subvert the nation. Marjorie Taylor Greene calls for secession in the name of preserving America. And AOC claims America does not even exist at all. We are under attack from all sides by these anarchists who share the common goal of preventing American government from functioning in the best interests of the American people. The anarchists have learned that the best means to destroy our national sovereignty and undermine our leadership is to run for office, and when elected, refuse to lead or purposefully mislead the American people, thereby causing government and society to fall apart and oppose itself. At the same time, anarchistic politicians and media of all types deliberately destroy the ability of the American people to think rationally and determine what is true and what is not. Americans are left confused and unable to decipher what is in their own best interests. The professional anarchists shock the masses with obvious lies about fictional extraterrestrial aliens and try to convince them that the earth is flat. They scream at Americans that it is absolutely necessary to get out and vote for their anarchistic politicians like Trump and Biden, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and AOC, but they concurrently claim that politics is otherwise pointless and no one of goodwill can achieve anything through the political process. The anarchists have figured out that the best way to destroy the American government, and with it the American people, is to become the American government and the American media of all types, and render them subversive and entirely ineffective institutions. In this way, they prevent the emergence and rise of any and all organic leaders who would work for the best interests of our nation and our people. We now have leaders who deliberately refuse to lead or consciously mislead the masses. We are ruled over by nihilistic anarchists who are eroding everything that keeps us whole and healthy. All the major and well-funded political parties are complicit in this deception. None of the political parties advocate sound policies which would improve the lives and lot of American citizens. Our only hope is sincere, independent candidates who openly state what needs to be done and what they will do as our leaders. Should they ultimately prove to be liars, at least their initial campaigns will have planted the seeds in the minds of the public of what can and must be done to defeat the anarchists and strengthen America. Our first outgoing American president, George Washington, warned us that this fate would befall us at the hands of political parties serving hostile foreign interests. President Washington knew that they would try to divide us along party lines and separate the nation into warring factions that mutually consumed us all for the benefit of our enemies. Washington knew that separatist and secessionist political parties would emerge in order to pit us against ourselves. Let's read what Washington had to say in September of 1796 as he was leaving office. Friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust. It appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now apprise you of the resolution I have formed to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, of your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth. And as this is the point of your political fortress, against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly, though often covertly and insidiously, directed, it is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. Think of Ron Paul, who appears on Russian television calling for secession. Think of the secessionist movements in California and Texas, which are funded by the Russians. Think of Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for a national divorce. George Washington warned us that these hostile foreign interests would attempt to pit us against us, and that these treacherous politicians would facilitate their efforts to break apart the United States of America so that our enemies can invade and conquer us. Washington continued, "For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. Here every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. The North, in an unrestrained intercourse with the South, protected by the equal laws of a common government, finds in the productions of the latter great additional resources of maritime and commercial enterprise, and precious materials of manufacturing industry, the South in the same intercourse, benefiting by the agency of the North, sees its agriculture grow and its commerce expand. The United States has the strongest position of any nation on earth. We control both the Atlantic and the Pacific and are isolated from our enemies by the Atlantic and the Pacific, which is why the Chinese, the Russians, and the Israelis want the United States to go to war against itself so that they can plant fifth columns on our shores in California and New York and drive us to go to war against each other. But as a united country, we help each other. We provide resources, agriculture, industry, educational institutions across the nation, all of which benefit each other. And these treacherous politicians in the Republican and Democratic parties are trying to ruin all of that and pit us against each other so that instead of helping each other, we destroy one another for the benefit of our enemies. The East, in a like intercourse with the West, already finds, and in progressive improvement of interior communication by land and water, will more and more find a valuable vent for the commodities which it brings from abroad or manufactures at home. The West derives from the East supplies requisite to its growth and comfort, and what is perhaps of still greater consequence, it must, of necessity, owe the secure enjoyment of indispensable outlets for its own productions to the weight, influence, and future maritime strength of the Atlantic side of the Union, directed by an indissoluble community of interest as one nation. That's even more true today when we have Alaska and California and Puerto Rico than it was when Washington spoke these truths in 1796. They must derive from union an exemption from those broils and wars between themselves which so frequently afflict neighboring countries, not tied together by the same government, which their own rivalships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which oppose foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues, would stimulate and embitter. That's what the Russians are trying to do to us with these secessionist movements and having their puppet politicians call for a national divorce. They are going to try to embroil us in civil wars, which will become foreign wars between balkanized Americans who are cutting at each other's throats and who invite in the Russians and the Chinese to our shores to mass murder us. Washington continued, "In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for the characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You can shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. Will it not be their wisdom to rely for for the preservation of these advantages on the Union by which they were procured? Will they not henceforth be deaf to those advisers, if such there are, who would sever them from their brethren and connect them with aliens? You see that the alternative media is trying to promote Vladimir Putin and Russia and cause Westerners to hate themselves and destroy their own nations in favor of Russia. Washington foresaw all of this. To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances in all times have experienced. Washington knew that if America became balkanized, we would become our own worst enemies, and that our foreign enemies would utilize those struggles to ruin all of us. All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put it in the place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of a faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. We can see that this is exactly what the Republican and Democratic parties have become as they bend the knee to Israel, Russia, and China, and Saudi Arabia, all of whom are antagonistic enemies of the United States of America. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Think of all the billionaires who control our society today. Think of the billionaire Donald Trump, who became president. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretexts. One method of assault may be to effect, in the forms of the Constitution, alterations which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. We see all kinds of movements trying to subvert our nation by inciting us to ourselves call for constitutional reforms and to change our currency. All of these proposed reforms will instead be used to strip us of our rights if we take the bait and open up the idea that the Constitution ought to be destroyed or amended. Washington went on to say, "In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions. that experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country. That facility in changes upon the credit of mere hypothesis and opinion exposes to perpetual change from the endless variety of hypothesis and opinion, and remember especially for that the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. We have to look with a very suspicious eye on those who are calling for us to amend or abandon the United States Constitution, which so well has safeguarded our fundamental liberties. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Look at what Marjorie Taylor Greene, who speaks up for Russia, intends to do to the United States. She wants to split us along geographical lines defined by political party. This is exactly what Washington warned us against. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally, and the Democratic and Republican parties in general are attempting to break apart the United States and make the government non-functional so that the American people rebel against their own system of government and destroy it for the benefit of our enemies. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which, in different ages and countries, has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. That's precisely what Donald Trump and the Republican Party is attempting to do. They are attempting to pit us against one another so that this despot, Donald Trump, can become a universal tyrant, ruling over and destroying America. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. We saw that happening under Trump in 2020 when there were riots in the streets, and then when he denied the election results and created an insurrection at the Capitol. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. We see that nearly the entire alt media is sponsoring Trump and sponsoring Russia against the best interests of the United States of America and American citizens. And this is being done in the name of the Republican Party, which is being utilized as a fifth column. Both the Zionists, who utilize it to promote the interests of hostile Israel, and the communists, who utilize it to promote the interests of Soviet Russia, always against the best interests of American citizens, and always with the intent to subvert us and bring us down.
If this Capitol crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment to our aid. And I don't even call it aid, our cooperation with Israel, because that's fundamental to fundamental.
Well, the biggest change I've seen in Congress is Israel literally owned Congress. You understand that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it was so powerful. It was so powerful. But I think you know exactly what I'm saying. They had such power. Israel had such power, and rightfully, over Congress.
So likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter. Think of the Middle Eastern wars. Without adequate inducement or justification. It leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others. Look at how Israel receives so much foreign aid that others don't receive, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. Think of how Israel has turned the Arab world and the world in general against America. And it gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to the favorite nation facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country, without odium, sometimes even with popularity, gilding with the appearances of a virtuous sense of obligation, a commemorable deference for public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good, the base of foolish compliances of ambition, corruption, or infatuation. That's true of the entire Christian Zionist movement, which has sought to bring down America for the benefit of Israel. Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi have both publicly stated that they will willingly subvert the best interests of the United States in favor of the nation of Israel. As avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? Such an attachment of a small or weak towards a great and powerful nation dooms the former to be the satellite of the latter. Think of how Sean Hannity, Nancy Pelosi, and Donald Trump demonstrate their fealty to Israel. Think of how Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene favor the interests of Russia. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influential to be avoided, instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side, and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. Real patriots, who may resist the intrigues of the favorite, are liable to become suspected and odious while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. The great ruler of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here let us stop. But if I may even flatter myself that they may be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit, to warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, this hope will be a full recompense for the solicitude for your welfare by which they have been dictated. Washington tried desperately to warn us of what was coming and what has happened, as both the Republican and Democratic parties have been subverted by communists and Zionists to work against the interests of the American people. Washington signed his final letter, his final address. George Washington, United States, 17th September, 1796.